There are fallible prophets all throughout. You had Moses murdering a dude, and then we have all of this happening.
I forgot about that. And he buried him in the sand. He buried the
murdered
evidence.
a guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would no. Murder means it was preconceived with malice in your heart.
You're right.
He saw the Egyptian whipping a fellow person, so some could say that it was an incidental.
Was a kill, not a murder.
You're right. But dude, he did bury the evidence, dude. That guy was straight gangster.
Okay, gospel topics essay. I feel like this is the
The Holy Grail.
Yeah. It's something that could be better, but is also it's underwhelming from both the active LDS position and the ex-Mormon position.
Yeah.
Ex-Mormons use it as a, boy, go read the gospel topics essay.
That'll really shake your faith.
Yeah, right.
I was like,
no,
not really.
It really won't.
It's like, what, really? No, but also, I mean, you're a reply guy on Facebook who posts 30 statuses a day and thinks we care what some, 2-liked review in a Deseret News article says. So maybe you're not the kind of person who I share a lot in common with anyway. You know what I mean? What are the two most talked about ones are the Book of Abraham and Blacks in the Priesthood one, right? Probably polygamy as well.
Polygamy
is huge.
So, I mean, which one do we cover first? Go
alphabetical order.
Hey, well, Jim's the guest. Jim's the guest. What are your thoughts on the gospel topic essays? But I noticed that's a big conversation in some of these apologetic conversations.
Right.
I mean, it's a big part of the conversation of some of these apologetic discussions we end up engaging in.
Okay, I love them. I love them wholeheartedly, although I don't think they go far enough to some degree. But I remember when the first one I became aware of was the Blacks in the Priesthood essay. Mm-hmm. And I saw it was there. I saw a link to it, and I went, oh, no. Because I had spent all of my time on my mission trying to come up with convoluted apologetic reasons why it really wasn't racist that we were denying the priesthood. And, the Jesus only came to the children of Israel. And
my dad was in Detroit when it got overturned.
Yeah.
Oh. Straight up. He was a missionary in the hood of straight up Detroit, dog.
Nice.
You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I can understand what you're talking about.
There was just so much rationalization and mental gymnastics, and I hate that phrase because that's overused, but just all this sort of struggling with it. And when I saw there was an essay on it, I thought, oh no, here we are. And then I read it, and it was like this huge breath of fresh air. It was like
interesting.
Well,
okay.
it was like, oh, so you admit that there was racism, and you admit that there isn't a revelation that justifies it, and you admit all of these things. It walks right up to the line of actually saying this was a mistake, but it never quite gets there. It just says we disavow all racism in the church, past and present. We disavow the idea that interracial marriage is a sin. We disavow this, and goes from there. And there are many people that I have met that are hardcore that it's like, well, the prophet didn't sign it. It's not real. It's not. And I just thought this is a huge step forward. This is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
The fact that nobody knows about them. The fact that sometimes when you talk about them in a gospel, when my wife was teaching about the priesthood ban and brought up the essay, there were people in the gospel doctrine class that had no idea this essay existed.
Yeah,
they haven't been
I've
referenced
experienced
from the pulpit.
a little bit of that.
They are straight up referenced in the Come Follow Me.
Follow Me.
Yeah, Come Follow Me is like, here's the gospel topics essay.
They're also in the app. Like
they're in
the gospel library.
Oh yeah. I mean they're there.
Yeah.
But the kind of they came about quietly. I mean, the Come Follow Me is. I mean, how many years ago was the essay was released in 2013?
And Come Follow Me's been.
And this is 8 years later.
Year.
Yeah, I mean, 7 years later. I mean, it's. I think it's a huge step in the right direction, and I applaud steps in the right direction. I would like to see it to be a bigger step, and I would like to see us continue to move in that direction. And I would like to see an admission, not even necessarily in a policy, but just a straight-up admission that this was an error, that this was a mistake.
Yeah, the only see, I remember I read it, and I thought, like so many people hate this. And I don't see why necessarily. I don't want to use the term nothing burger because I appreciate the academic research that went into it.
Yeah.
And the obvious, like, combing through the wording that they tried to make sure they were getting things respectfully as right as they could and so on and so forth. But I just remember thinking, like, this is not the scandal that it's been made up to be. It's been so long since I've read them that I honestly, I'm going off of emotional impressions right now. You know what I'm saying? I can't directly quote it. But I do remember thinking, after having worked extensively with blacks in the scriptures, you know what I'm saying, with Marvin Perkins previously in the day, it's always been it's always been a thing that's very near and dear to my heart, that trying to get that aspect right, you know, that just has not been handled right for so long. And I just remember kind of like thinking, okay, this is good, you know what I'm saying? But I didn't necessarily understand the scandal, and I think the real fix comes from
the scandal of the essay, or the scandal.
Well, you know, ex-Mormons all the time refer to it as
as though it's like the worst thing ever written, that it will be more damaging to your testimony to read the Gospel Topics essays than anything else, which, how?
Yeah, the only thing I took issue in, at least in the Blacks in the Priesthood one, was that when they said there's no clear origin of where it came from, kind of in a lot of the research that I had done with Marvin Perkins over at Blacks in Scriptures, it seemed like, as you were saying before, Kwaku, like, wasn't it pretty obvious that Sidney Rigdon, after his return from the South, kind of returned?
It was a Sidney Rigdon, William McCary combination.
Yeah, and
at least we can identify it's pretty clear that's where it started.
Well, I wouldn't think it's fair to say that that's where it started, but that was where a partial influence came from.
The ban was implemented effectively right
well
then.
And a partial influence, I think, was fair to say, pressure from the U.S. government when they were trying to declare is Deseret as a nation, you know, run by the governor, the political leader Brigham Young. Are you going to be an abolitionist state, or are you going to be a freeman state? Because let me tell you, there's a Mason-Dixon line we're drawing through the rest of the half of the country that's about to go to war over this issue. So you got to choose which side you're on. So I think it was a combination of political pressure. I think it was a combination of in the void of Joseph Smith having been killed by the anti-Mormon mob, doctrines from other faiths percolating in through very young members of the church that were serving missions and filling gaps, just like in Jurassic Park, they filled the gaps in the DNA of the dinosaurs with frog DNA, and that's what made it so they could have the switch that created the velociraptors and the Tyrannosaurus Rex females, you know? And then thirdly, I would say, it seems like Brigham Young was so respectful of Brother Joseph that though he may have disagreed on some aspects of priesthood bestowal and so on and so forth, he always went with the give it to anybody and everybody until a specific example where there was going to be interracial marriage between a guy he didn't like and the niece of somebody that he knew and loved. And it seems like a personal beef was filled in with ecclesiastical power that many would consider at best a grievous error, at worst potentially an abuse of power that requires reprimand. You know what I'm saying? So I don't think it was obviously just one thing, but I also don't think it's fair to just say like, oh, unclear origins. Maybe not clear enough that you can blame one person, but you know, I mean,
but there's a couple that we could maybe pin down.
Yeah, like let's add a sentence with 3 commas in it that indict 3 things here. You know,
well, but the unclear origins thing also, that there's an admission there, because the assumption for most of my life was that the origin was divine and that there was a revelation denying the priesthood to the blacks.
Yeah, because people don't want to believe that something they did that was silly, they did incorrectly.
I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that one of the reasons why it endured for so long, and people talk about that, is because nobody saw anything wrong with it, which is an indictment of the church, but it's also an indictment, I think, of American culture.
Yeah. Every other church at the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we never had separate congregations, racially segregated congregations. Whereas the Southern Baptists and everything else did, and still to some degree do.
The reason why there's the First and the Second Baptist Church was because they divided pre-Civil War over this issue.
But the fact of the matter is, it endured because it never occurred to a president of the church to question it, to think that there was anything wrong.
Well,
with
see,
it.
I push back on that. I wouldn't say it never occurred, because there were some that had deep and abiding issues with it, and there were some that kind of went along to go along and glossed over it.
Yeah, but not until David O. McKay.
Oh no, Orson Pratt. If you guys, Orson Pratt was.
Well, he wasn't the president of the church.
No, but he was arguing with the prophet. He said to deny the African.
Really, I didn't know this.
Yeah, it's like a beautiful to deny the African his role in the priest. I'm kind of butchering it. Priesthood, or his role in the church is to make the angels in heaven weep. Like he's like, it's a very like Orson Pratt was hardcore.
Good for you, Orson.
And so, but Brigham and Orson butted heads quite a bit, right?
Brigham again doesn't get along with a lot of folks.
Yeah. So like, I mean, there. And there was the Quaker influence to the church and the Methodist influence, and I think
hey, those
United
are your old
Methodists.
peeps, dog.
Yeah. Methodists have done nothing wrong. I will also add them. Methodists have nothing wrong, right?
Nice.
But they were pretty clearly abolitionists, whereas Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, those guys weren't, and so most of our church was. You had a couple, you had a Smoot. Right, who was a slave owner, member of the church, and people were like, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with this, but most were, W.W. Phelps, he did not like slavery. He made it clear, free people of color, and then they're like, what'd you say? Holding up the gun, he's like, well, actually, I'm kind of on the fence. He wasn't. We know what he believed, right? And so, I mean, it's complicated, but also, why would... We have this hindsight where we know what the moral thing of the day is, and so we go, I can't believe the church... Man, I can't believe they just weren't on top of it. Well, what Bible are you reading? Because I can't find anything. If we're making the definition of discipleship and priesthood and the church, the function, if the definition is always Enochian, if it's always you literally have to be the city of Enoch to be the true church.
Enochian, okay.
We're wrong. We're wrong. Okay, we're not the true church. But... If we're going by what it's defined and shown as in Scripture, we're supposed to be making some pretty big blunders. So again, when people say, well, how can the church be true because of this? I'm going, that's the wrong question. Because you have redefined church.
And it's a false expectation, I think. And that's the thing that I see with a lot of ex-Mormon arguments about these gospel topic essays, is they kind of try to give you a false expectation of what they should be, by giving you a false expectation of what the church should be judged by, which I think that's the root of a lot of the issues that people have, even within the essays themselves. That's why they had to be written, I think, to help explain these issues.
Moses came down from talking to God face to face, and the Jews who had just been saved and knew Yahweh was true was like, that golden cow looks kind of thick over there. Like literally, like that's how easily duped the people are. And that's the cream of the crop. You know what I mean?
Like, that's Aaron, the brother of freaking Moses. Like,
so I mean,
we named a priesthood after him.
I think we've done a horrible job fighting back on the question itself when they say, well, if the prophet made this mistake, then how is he the prophet? And I'm going, that question to me shows doctrinal, historical, and scriptural illiteracy.
Ignorance, yeah.
I'm sorry. The question itself is dumb. You can be uncomfortable with something a prophet did, but if you're going by what the definition of a prophet is biblically, I mean, yeah.
And my only problem with a lot of the ex-Mormon argument against it is that it's a rubric that they only apply to one organization in their life. When they find out that the simplified history of the United States isn't the same as the complex history, that maybe Paul Revere wasn't the guy that said the British are coming. Oh, and by the way, he didn't say the British are coming. It was that the regulars are coming. Oh, and there's a first-hand primary source account that he was so drunk at a tavern that he didn't actually make it out, and then another guy made it out, and he took the credit for it. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's all these, you know, like when they find out that, oh my gosh, Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you for shattering my testimony of Paul Revere.
Yeah, well, they find out that Thomas Jefferson had slaves, unfortunately, had non-consensual abusive relationships thereof, and there's descendants that still live in America from him, you know, and I don't see them going to the embassy, renouncing their passport and saying, I'm going to the perfect country over there. Because I just found out that George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree.
Well, yeah, except the expectation when you set up somebody as a prophet and you talk about their direct relationship to God, we have created...
Greatest church on earth? No, greatest country on earth.
But we have created an expectation of infallibility.
But I push back on that.
Wait.
When on earth?
We is the key word here. We
culturally
that's
not
your
from the
guys'
church
generation,
itself,
not
though.
me. Yeah.
But
well,
because I agree with you, I think it's a cultural thing. I don't think that the leadership of the church has tried to make that argument. I think that it is a cultural thing that they elevate.
It's a
all of these people.
post-war mentality.
I'm actually going to have to. Here's where I push back. One thing pastors do super well is, at least in the Methodist Church, again, I was a Methodist. You'll find them talking about their personal flaws in their sermons openly. And people think it would be bad, but it's actually kind of comforting because there are people in the audience who are like, okay, well, you have taught me so much about God and you have helped me in my spiritual journey. And knowing that you struggle with XYZ as well as me gives me comfort in the fact that I am still a Christian and I still believe in this and this is worth it and I'm not too sinful for Christ. I wish the apostles talked about their personal flaws more. Joseph Smith did.
Yeah.
But at General Conference...
he said, I am but a rough stone rolling. And, specifically says, I was guilty of the sin of levity. And, he did more than, boomer joke.
You can read the Revelations, and he gets chastised up, down, and sideways in the Revelations when the lost 116 pages.
That's interesting. That's a good point, Kwaku. I hadn't thought of that.
At conference, I'll speak for me, but I'll speak for a lot of people as well who I've had this conversation with. I often see the apostles when they're speaking at conference. I don't always see people. I see an office. And sometimes you need to see the person. I want M. Russell Ballard to be like, yeah, I was new selling the cars. You know what? Sometimes maybe I fibbed a little bit on the mileage. I don't know. I want to see some of the realness. I want to know, what did you do in college? How many times do you go to the bishop? Because you know what, Bednar? You're not bad looking. You're how many times? Uchtdorf, you are charming. How many of those German girls? I know I'm being funny, but yeah. I mean, that's reality. And I guarantee if we saw that at conference, you would see a major rise in youth activity because they would go, oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, here's my question.
This goes back to our authenticity thing.
Yeah.
Well, that goes back to the previous podcast we had on loyalty versus authenticity. But when you speak about flaws of your leadership, what's really interesting is I asked that of a bishop once. And I was like, being a bishop, bro, is there ever sins you hear people confess? You're like, dude, I feel you, man. You know what I'm saying? And he was like, you know what we're specifically told? I was told in training by my stake president. And he says, I don't know if this, he wasn't claiming any kind of backing of policy here or anything like that. He was just saying this is good advice I've been given. But he did say that he said, I hold back. And there has been times where personally, I have wanted to hug somebody and say, look, dude, I know exactly where you're coming from because I used to struggle with this too. And it was only until I matured out of it that I was, and the burden was lifted from me that I ever felt like I achieved righteousness in this aspect of my life. So I feel you. I do not judge you. I mourn with you. You know what I'm saying? And you may view me as this great church leader or whatever, but I am a fallen man who feels you, brother. He said there's been times where I wanted to do that, but I have been constrained. And he says, I often in those times of constraint have thought about a quote his stake president said during his training where he said, you will often find a desire to empathize with these people to such a degree that you're willing to confess your own previous sins. But in his experience, he found that now that became the emphasis of the thought process about you. That oh, that's the apostle that was getting with the German chicks because he was so charismatic and know how to pilot planes. You know what I'm saying? And it's and he said, in the risk reward analysis, I've never seen it worth it. So I don't know where I sit on that because I see both sides of that coin.
Well, I think I'm with Kwaku in that when I was a missionary serving in Scotland, I was assigned to serve in Thurso, Scotland, which is the northernmost point of the British mainland, which is where the Mackays came from, where David O. Mackay's grandfather was baptized.
Okay.
And there's nothing up there in terms of the church. We had two people that came to church. One was a retired lady, and another one was a mentally handicapped man, and we had a missionary couple up there who asked the man, why are you so faithful? And he said, well, I've got nothing else to do. And, that was it. Those are the only two members we had up there. And
Well, that was a joke, right?
no, he was absolutely, I've got nothing else to do.
Just like,
And so they got the ideas. I'm David O. Mackay's great-grandson. They wanted to do a kind of a public lecture about the prophet from Thurso. And he wasn't from Thurso because he was born after they'd left there. But anyway, so my grandfather was working on a book about his father, and it was eventually published called My Father, David O. Mackay. And he had a copy of David O. Mackay's missionary journal. And they sent me a copy up there to prepare for this. Now, growing up as the great-grandson of David O. Mackay gave me a tremendous amount of feelings of inadequacy. Here's this great prophet, and here's this schlub, Jim Bennett, who's a nobody, and then I read his missionary journal. David O. Mackay was a terrible missionary. I hate to say that. I don't want to be harsh. Didn't baptize anybody.
really?
Nobody. Now, part of that had to do with him being called into mission leadership fairly early in his mission.
Okay.
He used to talk about, you can hear, it's been in the correlated materials. You hear him talk about how he was a discouraged young missionary and wanted to go home until he saw that wonderful sign, whate'er thou art, act well thy part. And that stone was installed at the MTC in Provo, and all of this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, he was miserable. He didn't want to get out of bed. He missed his girlfriend. He used to skip days of missionary work to go tour whiskey factories in Glasgow. He talked about, he's like, I was attacked by this haggard-looking woman who thought that when I said gospel tract that I said gas bill, and I'd as soon die before I'd distribute tracts again. And he had disparaging things to say about the Scot. I'm sorry, I'm throwing.
I want to hear the disparaging things about the Scots because my family is all Scottish.
Well,
it's the
so's
Humphreys
mine.
clan.
The Scots are the most disparaging to the Scots
That's
of anyone.
right. That's right. Groundskeeper Willie. It's like Scots are natural enemies, like the English and Scots, and Japanese and Scots and other Scots. But what that did for me was all of a sudden it was like, if David O. Mackay can go from that to being David O. Mackay, president of the church, maybe there's hope for Jim Bennett. It was an extraordinary weight lifted off of my soul to know that David O. Mackay was a guy.
And even we have Nephi and Paul made sure to chisel in the plates to put on the paper. I was bad here and here, like, oh, wretched man that I am. Why can't we have modern apostles who talk about their flaws too? Because when I read the scriptures, I see that they did it, and no one's ever been like, Paul, the guy who
I feel like I've gotten that from Russell M. Nelson.
You
feel
do?
like I have.
I don't feel like
In some of the social media posts, yes. Not in the official capacity of any of the conference talks.
I agree.
But like when he's
very personable.
He's very personable, and like he breaks down and cries and talks about how
about his inactivity phase. Like
he's like, I've had doubts in my youth. He says it shook me when my daughter died. And he started crying, saying like, no.
Who doesn't it shake when their daughter dies?
Well, yeah, but you could also say, who doesn't say, "Oh, wretched man that I am"? Nephi didn't go out and say, "I am guilty of fornication." Right, you know what I'm saying? Like, he didn't get into exact specifics. He kept it in generalities.
He kind of did. He was guilty of anger with his brethren, right?
Yeah, but none of us fault the guy for that.
Solomon.
Well, he also sliced off some dude's head. And really wrestled with that, and
yeah, but at least he had confirmation from the Spirit that it's better that one man die than the entire nation dwindle in unbelief.
Yeah, but
was the effective prophet at the time, something none of us at this table can claim.
Well, I think there's a number of examples of talking. It's not a flaw to be heartbroken when your daughter dies. That's not a flaw. I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
Like-
But
that's
talking
not a
about his
sin.
period of inactivity is something that our culture views as something that's a flaw, right? So I
Okay.
see that.
I think if
That's true.
I am convinced, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm convinced if the apostles talked about when they have the YSA devotionals and these young adult devotionals, if they talked about their flaws and not the one time I sneezed in the temple and it was
Right.
supposed to be quiet, but I sneezed and they looked at me and I realized that, oh boy, I shouldn't have anything with pepper the next time I go into the temple. Like, no, give me a real,
Yeah.
Well,
That there's nothing wrong in that example
nothing
of
wrong-
charismatic leadership, which was the model of the early church.
that authenticity
Yeah.
is I think that would be so beautiful, and you would change the minds of some of the leadership, right? You hear about some punishments by bishops or stake presidents that are too harsh, and if they knew, boy, a prophet was I now I'm seeing the prophet when I look into this person who's repenting, it would change these relationships and dynamics a lot. I think it would be beautiful.
And I'm
I
starting
think it
to
would
agree with
encourage
you more.
sinners to be more open about their sin and their repentance.
And I think it would help change
Okay.
the entire conversation around repentance. Because I think there's a weird cultural thing in which we kind of treat repentance as a bad thing that you have to do. And I think that's exactly what Satan wants us to think repentance is.
Same with excommunication. I just had this exact same conversation, and I said, this guy was asking me, he's like, well, dude, why'd your church excommunicate this guy? And I said, well, what you have to realize is we're not Catholics. Like in Catholicism, especially in medieval times, when you were excommunicated, it was the equivalent of banishment from
Yeah.
your country, because the church was the state, was the church, was your unique connection with God. Whereas in Mormonism, it's simply, or not Mormonism, sorry, Church of Latter-day, in the restored gospel. You know what I'm saying?
Gospel.
In the
Okay.
restored gospel. It's just proof that we take the covenants we make seriously. And if you're struggling with something and you've covenanted not to sin in this regard, but you've effectively showed that you can't help yourself because one reason or another, we would rather present you before God as somebody who did not make that covenant to sin in that way. So you are judged less. And it shows that we take seriously concepts of judgment and accountability and so on and so forth. And when we excommunicate you, all we're doing is relieving you of the burden of service as a person who's covenanted to act better. And we freaking bake cookies for you, assign a Relief Society president and an Elders Quorum president to you, invite you to come to church, do everything we can to bend over backwards for you. You know what I'm saying? It's not a rejection of you saying,
Yeah.
get thee hence. It's look, this is hard for you. Let's relieve you of service and let's give you an easier job.
Well, that said, I am very encouraged by the fact that excommunication has become
Far less frequent.
rarer
Yes.
and rarer, and
Yes.
and even in the current handbook, the phrase is member restrictions. I mean, they don't use the phrase excommunication
Hey,
anymore.
Yeah.
So early church, I have some ancestors who were excommunicated for inactivity. They missed church for like a month.
Yeah, it was like savage, dude.
gone.
You know,
Well, my brother-in-law is a law professor, and he's explored the fact that excommunication used to be kind of a sort of a legal remedy. That people brought, church courts were sort of legal disputes.
yes.
And-
And Brigham
and
Young was a
that's-
theocrat. Like, let's be honest.
Yeah, and,
You know?
and that's changed significantly too, because I think, excommunication. When I was in a bishopric, some of the most spiritual experiences that I had were in disciplinary councils. And because it was such a testimony builder to me to discover that the bishop and myself as a counselor and the other counselor were so solicitous of the Lord to know that we were doing the right thing. And we had experiences where it was very clear, we wanted to do something one way and we ended up doing it another way. I think for the most part, this is a responsibility that leaders take very, very seriously. But I am grateful that excommunication is done only as a last resort when there aren't anything else we can do to spur someone to repentance.
So back to the original
Yeah,
subject
we've wandered
of this
away
podcast.
from the essays.
We wandered away from the essays. I guess sum up your approach to this. Like, do you think it's a half? There's multiple camps I've seen. Some people say half measure, we need more. Some people say a glorious this endeavor. Other people just, that are generally never content with anything the church puts out as an olive branch.
I'd say the first two at the same time. I'd say they are glorious, but they are still not nearly as far as we need to go. And I am very encouraged that we continue to go in that direction. I find the Joseph Smith papers to be an extraordinarily glorious thing.
Oh, yeah. The church has mondo guts. The fact that they went out, bought the rights to View of the Hebrews, and openly published.
Oh, they didn't have to buy the rights. It was in the public domain, but they openly published it.
They openly published it is the ultimate flex of we do not fear this thing.
No.
And the fact that they gathered every single paper they could get on Joseph Smith,
right,
published it in hardback, and free PDF to the world to see is just absolute flex of we do not fear any inquiry into this.
Also, I sometimes imagine being Joseph Smith. Would you ever want your personal journals published to the entire world?
Right.
He is still suffering. He has been through enough. You know what I mean?
Okay, so what would you do? Last question, Jim, is what would you do if you were called into the church office building? And just like you asked me of some things that I would like to see as an improvement before, I'm ambivalent on the church, on the gospel topic essays. You guys are definitely more knowledgeable on this. What would you like to see in the next version or the next one that comes out? What would you like to see?
This is one I actually have an answer to.
Okay.
Elder Ballard gave a marvelous talk to the church educational system, where he talked about gone are the days when somebody can come to you with an honest question and you can wave it away by bearing your testimony, or you can just say, don't worry about it. You, members of the CES, need to know these gospel topics essays like the back of your hand. I would like to see that talk, maybe even that exact word-for-word talk, delivered from the pulpit in General Conference. I would like to see the brethren announce these gospel topics essays are addressing areas of our history and doctrine that are controversial, that are difficult for many members, and we encourage members to read them, to ponder them, to study them.
Okay.
I would like to see, the Joseph Smith papers and the gospel topics essays, all of these things are great, marvelous moves towards total transparency that I think is necessary, and I would like to see us embrace it rather than just sort of quietly allow it to be there.
Now, but also, is that the church just quietly allowing it to be there, or is that just once again an indictment of us as a people who don't pay enough attention to anything the church releases? We show up and like, oh, come follow me, got done again? Oh, this is great. How did I not have this happen? Because you show up late to church every single time that they announce it. You don't read the emails they send out. You're a passive member of the church that sucks at staying in the know.
Yeah, but the church isn't sending out emails about the gospel topics.
I guarantee you when it was released, there was an email.
It's straight up in Come Follow Me. If we are doing what they're asking us to do, we will read them. It's there.
I'm humble enough to recognize that sometimes my frustrations with the church are frustrations that wouldn't be frustrations had I just been a better member.
Well, then I can claim good membership because I was aware of the gospel topics essays when they came out, but I was part of a very significant minority within the church.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And for years after the gospel topics essays, I had stories of people who would bring them up and they'd say, "You're talking about anti-Mormonism," and it's like, no, I'm reading from the gospel topics essay.
Yeah, it's probably going to be in the next quad that they release.
Jeremy Runnels with the CES letter talks about that all the time. Yesterday's anti-Mormon lies or today's gospel topics essays. I think that's harsh, and that's not necessarily. I think that's an uncharitable way to look at it.
Yeah,
but it goes back to my general thesis, which is that when we're dealing with apologetics, when we're dealing with defending the church, we have no choice but to be as upfront and transparent as possible. Yep. So when you ask what I would do, I'm not trying to indict the church, but this is what I would do. Yeah. I would say there isn't anything in here that we need to be afraid of. Yeah. By being afraid or reluctant to talk about it, we mystify it. We make it for the forbidden fruit. We make it somehow.
And for me, reading, I've always loved anti-Mormon literature because it's strangely a gateway into some beautiful faith-based stories. Mm-hmm. Because
I think so too.
I've always enjoyed my interaction with anti-Mormon interpretations of things, because oftentimes they'll introduce me to some wild and wacky church historical, thing that happened. And of course, they're giving me only the worst, most cynical interpretation, and like the bottom half of the quote that doesn't have the top half of the quote that serves their, nefarious purpose.
Right.
But then when I actually go and I look up the entire quote and actually read the original journal article, because I go on like Google Academic and actually look it up, I'm like, holy crap, yeah, this dude did a flaw, but he also sacrificed his life for the good of the, it's just like, holy crap, these guys are stud. Yeah, flawed stud, but total stud,
I wonder what you guys would think of this, and maybe this
and then we'll wrap it up, yeah.
Yeah, because I look at books like Rough Stone Rolling, and I look at how I read
Loved it.
and
Loved it,
thought it was
loved it.
amazing. It uplifted me, built my testimony. Other people I know have read it and had the opposite experience.
Right.
Shut up, really?
Yeah, and something that I've thought about, and I'm not sure if this applies well or not, but my mission president had a rule that we were only allowed to study what was in the missionary library until we'd read it all. And after that, anything was free game.
So he was a
good for your mission
heretic.
president.
Yeah, and so
A beautiful heretic.
I actually thought that was an incredible rule, and I ended up able to read through everything and got to read a lot of interesting things on my mission. But thanks to the actual basis in scriptural doctrine that I then had, I think it allowed me to contextualize everything. And so I think that there's maybe something to the gospel topics essays being the kind of thing that you read the whole set of the standard works first, so you understand the context of, this is the Book of Mormon, this is the Doctrine and Covenants. Here,
so you
now let's talk
understand who
about,
prophets like Jonas were and who prophets like Peter were.
And you
so when
recognize-
somebody makes a mistake, it doesn't rock you to your core.
there are fallible prophets all throughout. You had Moses murdering a dude, and then we have all of this
Oh, I
happening,
forgot
right?
about that. And he buried him in the sand.
He
He buried the
straight murdered
evidence.
a guy. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
And
I would
so-
no. Murder means it was preconceived with malice in your heart.
You're right.
He saw the Egyptian whipping a fellow person, so some could say that it was an
It was a
incidental.
kill, not a murder.
You're right.
Yeah.
But, dude, he did bury the evidence, dude. That guy was straight gangster, man.
Yeah.
That was
And-
mafioso stuff.
And so that is something that I think is, I don't know how to make that happen, but I feel like if the general church membership was able to establish that context, that enables things like the gospel topics essays to be read in their context. Because I think without some of that scriptural background and knowledge, you end up with some of the bad expectations that we've talked about, where you're like left only with the cultural expectations, and you haven't read about she-bears being sent on people because this guy's here. Like, there's a lot going on in the scriptures.
Which, by the way, that didn't happen. That's one of the biblical stories. I'm like, prophets aren't Dr. Doolittle. They can't make animals. Come on.
when you're up in heaven, that prophet's going to come up to you and say, "Hey, Kwaku, great to see you. I loved a lot of your apologetic content. Meet my she-bear."
Well, you've seen the meme on that where they wrote a verse for follow the prophet for
Yes,
Elisha.
yeah.
Elisha was a prophet, didn't have much hair.
Yeah.
All the kids that
something,
teased him said
something.
his head was bare. Then now came the grizzlies, ate them through and through. If you mock the prophet, bears will eat you too.
Okay, we're ending it. We are ending it right on that,
That's
dog.
awesome.
That was pretty freaking epic. For more serenades from Jim Bennett,
Yes.
check out our next video. This is Midnight Mormons.